So let me try to talk a little bit about the American economic crisis as I see it, where it's going. First, the United States is a very peculiar example of capitalism. It's not the norm. It's the atypical version. And that had to do with the fact that we didn't grow our capitalism out of a feudal background the way the Europeans did. And that produced in the United States a bizarre situation. A new kind of capitalism, quite successful, but it always had a problem from the beginning, from the time we became an independent nation. They always had one key problem in this economic capitalism. They had a labor shortage. They never had enough people. And that meant you had to bring people here. Now, we brought a certain number of Africans here against their will by force, as you know, but the bulk of the population had to be brought over here by some lure. And the inducement was high wages, higher wages than were paid wherever these people came from. And not only did you have to pay higher wages to get them here, you had to pay higher wages once they got here to keep them. Why? Again, free land. If a worker in New York or Philadelphia or Boston wasn't happy, he or she could get relatively free land 100, 200, 400 miles west. Hence the following stunning statistic about the United States. From 1820 to 1970, 150 years, real wages, that is the amount of money paid for the average American worker for an hour, adjusted for the prices he or she had to pay, so it measures how much stuff you could actually buy, went up every decade for 150 years, rising real wages. No other capitalist country has ever done that. You produced in the United States, therefore, a bizarre culture and mentality. It had to do with the following. One, there is something absolutely unique about the United States. Not the story I just told, but something else. If you're religious, then God loves America, especially. We are a country in which if you work hard, you do well and you do better over time. And your children will live better than you and your grandchildren still better and all of that. The thing I want to hammer home to you is it's over. It's been over since the 1970s. In the 1970s, the labor shortage of the United States stopped. Now that's a trauma in a culture. Right? The era of working hard and doing better, finished. There's no labor shortage. Americans didn't get paid well because they worked hard. They get paid well because there weren't enough of them. Hard as it is to accept that. But it means that when there are enough, you can work as hard as you want. You're not going to do better. You're going to do worse. Why did that happen in the 1970s? Because the world economy shifted. The very world economy that created this peculiar capitalism in the United States now shifted. What was it? Very simply, the computer removes vast numbers of people needed for work. Number two, the United States, because it had paid higher wages by the 1970s, had created, because that's how capitalism works, an immense incentive for American companies to look elsewhere for cheaper workers whose wages hadn't risen for 150 years. And there are lots of places that are eager to be candidates. And as if that weren't enough, we had two other phenomena. We had a very important historical movement. A vast new labor force entered the workplace looking for work just as the jobs shrank. The name of that labor force? Adult women, who, because of the women's liberation movement and several other things, moved into the labor force, looking for work, real work. And we had the latest wave of immigration. This was not from Europe, from Latin America, basically. The real wages of the United States in 1970 stopped rising, and they have never resumed. The real wage of an American worker today, the average amount of money adjusted for the prices in 2011, is what it was in 1978. So how did the American people handle this trauma? Badly. Because the trauma was never articulated. There had to be a culture in the 70s that said, hey, we're at a turning point in our culture. There's no more rising wages and not likely to be any. We had nothing of the sort. which meant that every American working class family had to face this crisis without information about why it was happening, without an understanding of it as a social problem. Here's how the American working class reacted to the trauma of change by individual actions. Two in the main. One, Americans began to do more work. You know, if you don't get more per hour, do more hours. And here's what the American family did. If the husband was working, he took a second job, maybe even a third one. The women, well, I've already told you, they had to go out and work. The teenagers began to discover the importance of after school and weekends, and the old people came out of retirement. What's the second thing? You borrow money like there's no tomorrow. So by 2007, guess what? Our working class is physically exhausted, emotionally stressed beyond words by the collapse of the family, and now into debt way over their head, because it doesn't take a genius, and it sure doesn't take a PhD in economics to know that if the debts keep rising for 30 years, but the wages that have to pay for it in the end are flat, there will come a day, certain, when you can't cover your debts anymore. And 2007, that's what happened. So let's review. What the employer gives the employee is flat. What the employee gives the employer keeps going up. That's why over the last 30 years, the United States has become a much more unequal society, because the mass of people got themselves into debt, while a tiny number of people, those around the employing class, did spectacularly well. When the American working class went into debt over the last 30 years, where'd the money come from to give them those loans? And the answer is, the extra profit the employers got because they didn't pay workers rising wages was taken by them and lent back to the American working class. Not only did the employers reap unbelievable profits, so we began in the 1970s, when this began, by developing the mythology of the genius entrepreneur. Starting in the 1970s, we start paying our executives wild amounts of money. American executives are paid much more than their counterparts in Europe or Japan. Second thing they did, they developed fancy new instruments to make even more money by trading obligations, derivatives, asset-backed securities, all that stuff. All of which had a particular thing in common. They were all new financial instruments based on the debts of the working class. Asset-backed securities means a security that isn't a share of a company making something. It's a share of a debt obligation in the society. Mortgage debt, credit card debt, car payment debt, college student debt. All of those things have been made into securities that are bought and sold by the trillions around the world. But they all depend on the ability of the underlying working class to pay back. But you created the impossibility for them to do that. And by 2007, the explosion happened. The speculations collapsed because they were premised on a working class whose debt level was unsustainable. We've been here before. This is not the first time. The last time, and the only relevant example to really use these days, is the Great Depression of the 1930s. What happened? Two things, two big lessons. Number one, we had a radical shift in the government's policy. There were three organizations in the 1930s that made all the difference. One, the biggest surge in labor movement in American history. We've never had anything before like it. We've never had anything since. It was called the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations. Swept across the major industries, auto, steel, rubber, chemicals, all of that. Suddenly there were millions of workers, joining unions and demanding that the government deal with the suffering of the mass of the working class. We also had very strong, powerful, and influential socialist and communist parties in those years. And together with the labor movement, in which they were the activists, they made the noise deafening, and Mr. Roosevelt shifted gear, big time. He went to his own people Roosevelt came from one of the oldest, richest, best connected families you could come from in the United States. People who had already been president. He went to them and he split them down the middle. He gave them a simple message. He said, hey, I have to do something for the mass of people, because if not, this system isn't going to be here much longer. So you better give me money, lots of it, your money, your wealth, your income. You got to give it to me so that I can take care of the mass of people. Because if you don't, coming down the road behind me are the CIO, the communists, and the socialists, and they're going to cut you a lot less attractive deal than I'll give you. Here's what they did. In the middle of the 1930s, the depths of the Depression, they found the money to create for the first time in the United States an old age retirement program called Social Security. We didn't have that before. Number two, we created the unemployment compensation system. Before that, if you were unemployed, tough. Go to church. Beg. Beg. But the best, between 1934 and 1941, Roosevelt created and filled more than 12 million jobs. There was no money. Sure there was. The money was there because there was pressure from below that said, you better find it quick, or you're going to be history. And guess what? They found it. Here's where they found it. By 1942, here's the way the taxes in America worked. For every dollar that Washington got by taxing individual incomes, it got $1.50 by taxing corporate income. In other words, corporations as a group paid 50% more to Washington than the individuals. What's the relationship today? For every dollar that individuals pay to Washington, it collects from the corporations taken together 25 cents. Over the last 50 years, we've had a shift of the burden of taxation from corporations to individuals. But that's only half the story. Let's take a look at individuals. In 1950s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and for those 3 decades, what was the income tax bracket of the highest, the richest Americans? You ready? 91%. What is the tax bracket on the richest Americans today? 35%. From 91 to 35. So here we are. All of the reforms, just about, of the Great Depression, undone in the 40, 50 years since. One of the great hallmarks of reform in the 1930s was a law called the Banking Act of 1933, otherwise known by the names of the 2 congresspersons who put it together, Glass and Stegall. It prevented banks from using their depositors' money to make investments. It split banks into depository banks and investment bank. Investment bank, Goldman Sachs, things like that. But they went to work to undo that, and they did it. And 8 years later, the same financial collapse happened that led to that law being passed. And there are now those who imagine that what we need to do about the crisis today is to regulate these banks and to regulate these corps. Stop. We've been there. We've done that. That doesn't work. All that does is condemn us to watch while whatever we struggled enormously to achieve in the way of reforms is undone. You don't change the system, you get the way this system works. We have a system that doesn't work. It doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work here. It doesn't work in Europe. You can watch it. It doesn't work. It has now polarized the society into rich and poor, and therefore it does not make the basic recognition possible. You can't have 1% doing terribly well and 99% not, because it takes 10 minutes to show you that the well-being of the 1% depends on the other 99%. And therefore, if you screw the 99%, in the end, that's what you're going to do to the 1%. And here's the proof. When this crisis hit, particularly in the middle of 2008 and into March and April of 2009, there was widespread belief that the American economic system was going to stop. And by the way, stop. Not have a difficult stop. That means there would be no trains running. There would be a problem with food delivery into the city of New York, about which there were officials from the Bloomberg administration giving advice about how that would be handled, just so you understand how serious it was. Decisions were then made to massively intervene, $7.7 trillion flooding into the American banking system. Our banks cannot survive, not 5 minutes, without the government support they have now. I can see from your faces. One example, just so you get a sense of it. Over the last three years, 90% of all mortgages written in the United States, 90% are either owned by the United States government or guaranteed by them. If the United States government didn't own or guarantee 90% of mortgages, the demand for housing in the United States wouldn't be there, which means that the price of your home would be half what it is now. The banks can't function without the government, and your wealth is immediately dependent right now and has been for years. So the idea that we live in a private enterprise system is pure ideological nonsense. We have a private system on life support from the government, which pretends that's not the case because of our ideological commitments. So for the last 3 or 4 years, we have recovered our financial sector. We have pumped unbelievable amounts of money into our banks, insurance companies, large corporations, and the stock market where they play. For the vast mass of Americans, no recovery at all. Unemployment has stayed around 9%, give or take, for 3 years. We'll have more foreclosures in 2011 than we had the previous years. The level of benefits is dropping. The real wage, if you include benefits, is dropping. Job prospects are awful. And the consensus estimate for 2012 will be that it'll be a worse economic year than this one was. So stop. This is a failed recovery system. It services the people who control our politics. Last point. Over the last 30 years, the mass of American working people were subject to unbelievable stresses. More hours of work, disrupted family life, if not disintegrated, levels of debt they could not sustain. Of course, they withdrew from social activity. They withdrew from political activity. The mass of people withdrew. The mass of Americans didn't stop being Democrats and liberals and leftists the way they had been in the 30s and the 40s. They didn't stop. They didn't change their minds. They withdrew. And as they withdrew because of their life situation in a capitalism that was screwing them, those with the money took a part of that money and didn't just pay themselves high wages and didn't just speculate in derivatives. They also went and they purchased the best democracy money can buy. And so we're surprised. Poll after poll tells us that the majority of Americans want something, and the Congress acts like they don't. And we keep on, what is that? What is that? There's no mystery here at all. Those Congress people, I talk to them from time to time. They even have me come and testify. They explain to me, I agree with you, Rick. But if I did that, I'd be out of office in 6 weeks, 6 months. What do you want me to do? Kill myself? I have to do that, but although I'm gone. And when I'm gone, they're going to have another person in there who will do what they want. So I get nothing. You get nothing. Here's the concluding irony, and this is as true of Europe as it is of the United States. A crisis brought on by a system that doesn't work anymore. Fixed by a political elite, purchased by the same economic forces that brought us the crisis, turns out to do a surprising thing. Take care of the people who took care of them. Money to the banks and the insurance companies. Of course, they recovered the people who put them there to do that, leaving the rest of the American people to watch. But here's a little hooker that's a little fly in the ointment. When the government stepped in to bail out those who had brought us the crisis, it had to borrow a lot of money to do that. Because it's impossible politically to bail out the rich by taxing the mass of people, then you would have had blood in the streets. They didn't do it, they borrowed it. And now they have to begin to deal with this enormous increase in debt, whether that be in Greece or in California or anywhere else. And so the question is, who's going to pay for it? And this political system built on this capitalist economy has the answer. You. You're going to pay. We're going to give you less garbage pickup. We're going to have fewer teachers and firefighters and social workers. We're going to wait. You're going to have to wait 2 years longer to get your Social Security. Think with me for a minute as an economist. We have record unemployment. We can't generate enough jobs to provide just employment for the new young people entering the labor force. What we should be doing is lowering the age of retirement so people retire, opening the space for those who need it most. Instead, the geniuses in Washington are raising the retirement age, keeping the old people in longer so that those of you that are young are screwed a little longer as well. The system doesn't work. And my final thought for you is it doesn't help anyone to pretend that the system is not broken. Capitalism is like that refrigerator that you've had for 40 years. And you call the repairman and he comes and he looks at you and he sees the sadness and fear in your eye. You want to be told it's just $30 to fix that motor. You want that. Your face radiates it. And part of him wants to sell you the crappy motor knowing you'll be calling him back in 2 weeks. But he's a decent guy. So he leans across your kitchen table and says, now don't get upset. You gotta get a new refrigerator. Capitalism is a system that we should have had debates about for the last 40 years. We didn't do that as a nation. We debate our education system, good, bad, how does it need to be changed? Our transportation system. Last year, remember, we spent all this time on our health delivery system and our health. We deal with our systems and we criticize. Good thing about the United, we do that. But not on the economic system. For 50 years, taboo. You can't question capitalism. It's so crazy that in my profession of economics, most of my colleagues teach about the system produces efficiency and equilibrium. Of course it doesn't, but they need to talk like that because there was a taboo. And you know what happens to a system, an institution, that you're not allowed to criticize for 50 years? It rots. It breaks down. We couldn't. And what we're doing now, thanks to Occupy Wall Street, is we're beginning to have the debate about our system that had we been a healthy society, we would have been doing for the last 50 years. We've got a lot to catch up on, and there ain't much time. What would have to be done? You'd have to do something so that the story I told you about the Depression, of all the reforms and all the changes and all the taxes that were levied and how they were taken away again, and how the laws were undone. You'd have to do something about that. What does that mean? Well, we have a business organization that is the problem for us, at least a central part of the problem. It's called a corporation. And let's remember how it works. A tiny group of people control the bulk of the shares. Just so you know, 1% of shareholders own roughly 60 to 70, depending on how you count, percent of the shares. So the major shareholders are the ones who have all the votes. What votes? Shareholders vote for who the board of directors is. The 15 to 20 people that run every corporation. Those are picked by the shareholders. The workers may live with the results of what a board of directors does. For example, closing a factory in New York and opening one in China. Or using a toxic technology that destroys your lungs in 5 years. Those decisions are made by boards of directors. Guess what? For all boards of directors and major shareholders, the reforms passed in the 1930s, Glass-Steagall Act, high taxes, all of that, those are obstacles for them. They're hired to build the company, to make it more profitable, to give it a larger market share, to have it grow. For them, regulations, rules, reforms, taxes are so many obstacles to overcome. That's what they're paid to do. And what do they use to do it? The profits, which gather in their hands. A corporation has the incentive to undo reforms, and it has the resources to realize those incentives. It is stupid to reenact reforms, leaving in place the institutions we know must and will and have the resources to undo them. We've just been through that. So the solution, I would urge for people, change the organization of our enterprises. We have to do that. And the proposal for workers to become their own board of directors, to thereby socialize the enterprise, is the logical way to accomplish this. And for those of you who take seriously, as I know most of you do from the things you've said, the concept of democracy, the corporation should be an embarrassment for you from the beginning anyway. Think about it. As an adult, you work 5 out of 7 days a week at a job, most of you for a corporation. It's the major thing you do in your adult life. If democracy means anything, it's got to be there. That's where you are as an adult. Democracy in the enterprise means those, like the old idea, those who live with the consequences of a decision ought to have the right to participate in making it. Otherwise, you don't have a democracy. But major shareholders and boards of directors, a tiny minority, have all the power. They decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. Those are all the basic decisions. So if you're a Democrat with a small d, you should have wanted this anyway. But now I'm pointing out that by not democratizing enterprises, you're leaving in place an institution designed and provided with the resources to undo the kind of economic society we want and need to avoid the crises we're suffering from. This is craziness. And only a society that has this kind of political leadership, and unfortunately so much of this ideological leadership in our culture, makes us unable to confront what we kind of already know. The thing that surprised everybody is that Occupy Wall Street, in poll after poll, had a majority of Americans sympathizing with what they said. That is the strength we have to now mobilize. But it's already there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much.